Hi, this is Joseph Tan here from goodmonday.com. Why moving on is actually bad advice. When someone has a negative experience or situation, our advice to them tend to be, hey, let's just move on. Don't be stuck in the past. We've got to move on from the negative to the positive. In fact, in today's culture where speed is of the essence, we should not spend time brooding over the past. We just need to move on to the positive future. Does this sound reasonable? All this sounds very reasonable from a pragmatic standpoint, but from an emotional perspective, there is this stage called the emotional inertia that we need to address as human beings. Well, moving on will work if we are just a machine with start and stop buttons, but we are not. We are actually a human being with a bundle of emotions that needs to be processed before we can actually look forward to the future, especially after a negative situation. That's why it is important for us to go through this particular phase called processing the grief. There is a certain emotional inertia that we need to overcome before we can really move on. Before we talk about the steps to process the grief, let me cover the consequences of skipping this process. When we move too quickly and we neglect this emotional inertia reality. Number one is triggered anger. Have you ever had the situations where you suddenly become angry because of certain words, certain reminders, or certain clues or cues that are given that points back to an unresolved past or something negative that happened to you in the past? It will trigger you to be angry in ways that sometimes that you do not expect, because this is the consequence of skipping this particular process. Or it could be unexplained depression. You know, there are days when you feel down and you don't really know why. Of course, every now and then we do feel down, but there are also certain seasons where there is prolonged depression, where there is something inside you that just don't quite click. It could be because you have not taken steps to process through the grief and you have taken the advice of moving on too quickly. Thirdly, it could be the inability to forgive, the inability to let go of your grudge, the inability to release a sense of emotional freedom, both for you and for the other person. So the inability to forgive may hinder you actually from moving on, because the inability to forgive prevents healing from taking place. And healing can only really take place if we learn how to process the grief and don't skip this emotional inertia phase. Let me share with you 4 steps to process the grief. Step number 1 is to lament. What is lamenting? Lamenting is to complain without blaming. Most of the time people complain, but the trouble is when they complain, they also blame. When you complain and you also blame, this leads to bitterness. But in order for you to rightly process the grief, you can still acknowledge the pain. You can still acknowledge the difficulty. You can complain without blaming. You can express your personal feelings without being personal to other people. Learn to articulate how you really feel to a close friend. Your ability to articulate and to lament, that is without blaming, is key. Secondly, it's a step of humility. It is a step whereby you acknowledge your limitation. It is actually a step of surrender. You don't need to have everything under your control. It is when we want everything to go our way, when you want everything to follow the way you expect it to turn out, that's when you bind yourself into a corner and you are not willing to surrender your expectations. So secondly is we got to realize that yes, in life, things do not always turn out the way we expect it to. We cannot be a control freak and still process the grief. We must acknowledge that we are limited in our activities. We need to have an attitude of surrender. Not giving up, but just surrendering our expectations. But surrendering would not work if you do not know what are your sources of security. What is it that really matters to you? At this phase called trust, it is a time to reflect. Are you structuring your life on what is eternal? On what that will last even longer than your life itself? Are you structuring your life around that which cannot be destroyed or taken away? If you are structuring your life around possessions, around material stuff, then when it is taken away, then you would have lost trust and hope in life. You need to establish your source of security in something that will truly last. The fourth stage is refresh. That means you take time to reflect, leading to a season of renewal, not regret. You go through a time where you reflect on your life. You might want to do a little bit of journaling. You might want to get into conversation with a close friend. You might want to take some time off for a personal retreat or holiday. Reflection leading to renewal. Remember, not regret. Renewal is only possible if you've gone through the first 3 steps. If you don't go through the step of lament, surrender, and trust, and you go straight into reflection, you might get too introspective and it might lead to a stage of depression. It is important that you go through all these 4 steps of lament, surrender, trust, and refresh in order to properly overcome the emotional inertia before you really move on. So whenever you see someone going through a negative experience in life, please don't be too quick to dispense this popular cliche. Just move on. Forget about the past. This is actually bad advice. Help the person not to move on yet, but to actually process through the grief. Acknowledge the grief. Acknowledge that there is the emotional unbundling that needs to take place, or else the consequences will happen in the future in ways that we do not expect it, in anger, depression, and unforgiveness. And that is not worth it. Spend the time to process the grief, and you will save time in the future later on by being able to truly move on. Think about it. This is Joseph Tan here from goodmonday.com. Thanks for watching. If you're interested to find out more about my leadership development programs and services, check out the website goodmonday.com. And I also offer online coaching services. The details are at goodmonday.com/coaching. Thanks for watching.